So today's lecture will be an introduction to heterogeneous computing. So the rough layout of the lecture is as follows. We'll start by understanding the term heterogeneous computing. Then we'll look at some scenarios where it makes sense to actually use this kind of computing. And then we will look at a choice of different types of accelerators. So after that, we'll go a little deeper into the heterogeneous computing model. Right? So we'll look at the memory model and communication, and then if time permits, we'll go into Amdahl's law. Otherwise, we'll cover it next time. I'm hoping most of you who have done a computer architecture course are already familiar with Amdahl's law. Then we look at some, just a quick overview of some programming models. So how is it different programming in software versus something which is realizable in hardware? And then exactly what is the role for, a framework like OpenCL for programming accelerator-based systems. So if you look up the word heterogeneous in the dictionary, basically what it means is something that consists of dissimilar or diverse ingredients or constituents. Okay. So now with regard to computing, what does it mean? So when we talk about a heterogeneous computing system, basically this is something which consists of multiple computing nodes. So that is where the heterogeneity or the diversity comes. Right? And this is because there are multiple computing nodes. This is basically inherently a parallel system. And that is one thing to keep in mind. So one of the big advantages of using heterogeneous computing is that you actually have a parallel framework of computing elements that you can leverage. Right? Now, the computing nodes could be different in many ways. So you could have nodes which are different in terms of their architectural capabilities. That is exactly, what are they tuned to do well. You could also have different ways of executing instructions. And this is what we call a programming model. So what are some different ways of thinking about heterogeneity? So, the earliest parallel computers actually were homogeneous. So they had the same CPU, they were basically CPU based. They had the same cores replicated on a large scale, right? And one of the initial takeoffs on this was to, use such a homogeneous array, but have situations where the cores actually could scale their voltage and frequency depending on the node. So basically we use some of these concepts even in modern day laptops, for example, or very large systems. So basically if the load on a system is lower, you can trade off on performance versus power. Maybe you don't need that much performance. So you trade off on power by reducing the frequency at which it runs, sometimes reduce the voltage at which it runs, right? And so that is one kind of heterogeneity. This is a little different from what we're looking at in this course, but it is still heterogeneous in the sense that the cores are architecturally the same, but physically the way they run is different. Right? The other way of thinking about heterogeneity is where you have cores with different architectural capabilities, but the same execution model. So this is typically a situation in which you would have cores that run sequential programming models. So a very good example of this is where you have a CPU and a GPU working together. So both inherently work on a sequential programming model, but they are tuned to do very different things well. So a GPU is tuned to do graphics well. GPUs actually started off by being chips that were used to drive graphics outputs. And then from there, they evolved to be able to do graphics-based computations really well. And then from there, they've evolved further to do all kinds of machine learning applications very well, typically in the training space. So that is the second type of heterogeneity. And here it is, sometimes a little easier to program because the mental model in which you think about, execution on these cores is basically similar. The third way, and that is what we are basically going to explore in this course, is where you have heterogeneous nodes with different architectural capabilities as well as different execution models. And this is what you see when you have a CPU or even a GPU working with an FPGA. So an FPGA is, it basically, the way you think about execution there is more hardware centric. It's not essentially sequential in nature. So the whole notion of taking an application and porting it to an FPGA or porting a part of it to an FPGA requires a different way of thinking about how you execute. It requires a different way of thinking about how you would optimize your overall performance. Okay? And that is why this course. So if it was very straightforward, you wouldn't need a course to study it, right? You would basically look it up and roll. That brings us to the next question. Why should we consider heterogeneous nodes at all? So, it's much more complex, especially when you have to manage different execution models. So for one thing, programming these heterogeneous compute systems is definitely more complex. Verifying them is much more complex. And then we have a whole lot of hardware challenges in the way they work together, right? How do you manage how they talk to memory? How do you manage how they communicate with each other, right? And each of these comes with its own set of complexities. So why is it worthwhile dealing with this kind of complexity? Right? And the reason is that, the ability to choose between different types of compute actually allows you to get much better performance and power or energy efficiency for your application. Right? And this can basically be dependent on the characteristics of your application. Right? So if you had something which, for example, had a lot of inbuilt data parallelism, right? You might choose to actually use a GPU to do those aspects of the application. And you might choose to do the more control heavy part of it on a CPU, which is tuned for that type of operation. Right? You might, choose to, since, as we saw in the last lecture, there are, CPUs are very good at general purpose programming, but they tend to take a lot more power because they are built to be more generic. Right? So you might choose to, even build a small ASIC to, offload some computation that you have to constantly do. And you could build a small chip that would, do this really well. Or you could choose to program an FPGA with that type of operation. So the reason to consider any kind of heterogeneous computing is that it allows you to get both performance and energy efficiency. So any questions so far? Okay, so let's quickly look at some different types of heterogeneous computing nodes. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. And the number and variety of different types of processors are actually changing a lot over the last maybe 4 or 5 years. Right? So the first and oldest is a CPU. So these are typically, very popular architecture is x86, which is seen in Intel and AMD servers or desktop PCs. Then you have ARM, which is very popular in embedded chips. Then you have RISC-V, which is an emerging architecture. Right? These CPUs nodes could be multi-core or single core. And as we know, they typically follow a sequential programming model. Now, next you have GPUs. So GPUs consist of an array of specialized computing elements or cores. So each core is smaller than a CPU core, but it is really tuned to do certain types of instructions well. And this whole notion of having, the whole GPU architecture is actually tuned to be able to do the same operation on large amounts of data in parallel. And this model is called SIMD, which stands for Single Instruction Multiple Data. We'll probably cover more about different types of compute models in a later lecture. Now, GPUs also are inherently sequential in the way that they are programmed, because you think about compute instructions being run on data. Then we have DSPs. DSPs actually are very, very old family of processing chips. And these are specialized for signal processing functions. So a DSP basically has its own architecture, which works very well to do Fourier transforms, convolution, and those types of applications. And the whole architecture of the compute units and the memory on the DSP is tuned to handle that. So you often find systems where you might have an array of DSPs, doing some kind of specialized computation, and a host which uses that computation. Now DSPs, again, they have their own language. So a DSP actually has its own assembly language even. I remember programming DSPs in assembly when I was a bachelor's student. And today's DSPs actually have compilers that take a higher level language and translate that to assembly, so, similar to what happens in CPUs. So then we have FPGAs. So FPGAs are configurable at runtime to different functions, as we saw in the last class. And here, the advantage that you get with an FPGA is that you can achieve parallelism in hardware. And the nature of the parallelism that you can achieve is basically different. So, you can get, maybe you could program an FPGA to do, 10 very small parallel compute elements, or you could program it to do, 2 larger compute elements, right? And this is very much in the control of the user. Now, of course, that comes with the trade-off that it is much more complex to program and implement compared to something that you would have to write on a CPU. Though that is definitely changing as FPGAs become more a part of the mainstream accelerator landscape. So you'll find that most vendors who are selling FPGAs or any kind of configurable logic are actually looking at easy ways to integrate programming these into existing frameworks. And that, by the way, is true of pretty much any accelerator, including tensor processors. Now these are kind of the bigger families of accelerators. Now you also have more specialized accelerators. Micron has introduced a very interesting kind of processor called an automata processor. So if you just Google, you'll be able to read about it. And this basically it handles domains which are easily mapped to finite automata very, very well. And they do this by leveraging the fact that you can use large memory arrays to efficiently implement state machines. And so these kind of processors are very well tuned to do things like graph analysis, pattern matching, or statistics with very high performance. So this is a relatively new type of processor. It's a very interesting kind of architecture. Then we have specialized ASICs which do what's called neuromorphic computing. So this is a kind of computing where we try to build hardware that mimics the way the human brain works. Many of these have come out of IBM. So a well-known example is IBM Watson, and then there's IBM True North, which is a newer processor. So these are also specialized chips which can be used again to accelerate certain types of computing. Then, of course, we have tensor processors. For example, the Google TPU, which came out a few years ago. And these are, processors. They're basically chips which are very, very tuned to these machine learning type of workloads. So they do tensor operations very, very efficiently. Okay. And now a challenge with all these these types of processors is that when you build an ASIC to do them right, you are pretty much tying yourself down to a specific definition or a specific workload or a specific way of solving a problem. And in a field like machine learning, which, as you know, is changing very, very fast, it is, sometimes not easy to freeze on those definitions. And you may actually find that, the landscape or the nature of the workload has changed a lot by the time you have designed and taped out your chip. Okay. So, right. So, we still see that even in, data centers where they have tensor tuned processors and chips, there is still a need for accelerators that are more configurable to changing workloads or new algorithms and so on. So any questions here? So yes, please.
Ma'am, like you said, like this tensor processor and the processors, it can be implemented in FPGAs also, like, but they won't be efficient, but they can be implemented, right?
I'm sorry, which ones can you implement in FPGAs also?
The tensor GPU, like TPU.
Right. No, they could be. So you can definitely implement any kind of tensor operation on FPGAs also. See, the difference there again, right, is this whole performance versus configurability trade-off that we talked about last time, right? So if I can build, see, if I know exactly what operation I need to do, right, I can build an ASIC to do it in a fraction of the power and with much higher performance. That's a given, no matter what the operation. Right? Now, the trade-off is that it takes me a lot of time and design time to design, verify, and then tape out the ASIC and then bring it back. Right? Does that make sense? Right?
Yes.
So today in FPGAs, actually what you'll see is very common is the concept of an overlay. Okay, so an overlay basically is a microarchitecture which is built on top of an FPGA. So for example, right, you could build an overlay to do, let us say, tensor operations, right? And so that, that comes in the form of, an RTL designed IP, right? Which is actually implemented on the FPGA, but it will come with its own instruction set and, a way to program it and so on. So it is a little more generic and a little easier to program than directly taking your application and implementing it on an FPGA, but it brings with it the advantage of configurability, right? So if I want to add a new feature, or tune my design to handle a different workload, it is much easier than taping out a new chip. Right? So it makes sense to go that route and build a processor or an ASIC to do something only if you know that the volume justifies the cost. And that's why it makes sense for a company like Google or Facebook. You'll see here that many of these companies are actually building their own ASICs now. And the reason it makes sense for them to do it is because they have these huge data centers all through the world, right? So if they know that, there is a certain operation that they need to do very fast and very often, it makes sense to, put that in an ASIC. In the industry, that's called hardening. So, if you take something which, could normally be done in a configurable way, whether on a CPU or an FPGA or something else, and you build, custom hardware for it, that's called hardening. So basically you decide then that this is a function which is worth hardening because the volume and the need for performance justifies the cost.
Yes, ma'am, that answers my question.
Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Any other questions?
You had mentioned that there are these machine learning accelerators, the VLIW instruction set thing in Xilinx, right? So that
Right.
IP, is it available for hardening if you want to make an
Actually,
ASIC?
that's a hardened IP, Lavanya. It's actually already hardened. So it's an array of VLIW processors,
I see.
which is already part of the. It is part of the Xilinx chip. So maybe this is maybe let me just take a second. I'll go back to that slide. I went very fast through it last time. So I had to get special permission to post these slides. So that is why I have not posted them yet, but I will in hopefully a few days.
Okay.
So these are the, let me know when you can see the. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you see now?
Yeah.
So this is the one you were talking about.
Correct. So this AI engine on the right-hand side, right?
Right.
So can we buy them off the shelf as IPs, like at RTL level?
No. This is a hardened. This is a hardened part of this entire chip. So it's a part of the chip.
I see.
So it's actually, it is an array of VLIW processors, which has been integrated with the programmable logic and all this other logic on the chip.
Correct. But that AI engine on the right is an ASIC flow based hardening that is being done, right? It's not configurable thing. It's just that the number of VLIW processors that you have put in that will vary from part to part, I suppose, right?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah.
And if you look at the Versal family product data sheet, which is available on the website, you'll see that each one talks about AI engines and how many AI engines are available. So it refers to the number of cores. So it's just like how many DSPs you would have on the FPGA.
Correct.
It is the same thing. Yeah.
Can an analogy be drawn to a GPU with respect to these AI engines, in the sense that GPUs have these shared processors, SP, and then there's a shared memory and so on, right? So these VLIW processors are nothing but some like a GPU core. It's an AI core in some sense, right?
Correct.
With some shared memory on the with inside the chip itself, right?
Correct. Exactly. Okay. Yeah, they're quite similar in that sense. I think the difference is that these AI engine, the cores are actually tuned to do AI inference efficiently.
Correct. So you support 8-bit or like in terms of these AI engines capability, is it quantized, like in the sense when you say inference, right? What is the precision of the data?
So the inference can go all the way from, the
data type.
The data type can go all the way from 16-bit to, I think we support 7-bit and 4-bit also. But that is pretty much supported through software, quantization. So one thing, now that you're talking about quantization, and this will I think be a relevant point to, all the students here also as you think about your projects. So one thing to remember about FPGAs is they largely handle fixed point arithmetic. When you're doing anything on the fabric, especially, it is, all fixed point arithmetic. And, that can sometimes lead to some interesting trade-offs versus floating point. There's a lot of literature though now which shows that, small number of fixed point arithmetic actually is sufficient. So, 4-bit or 7-bit fixed point is actually pretty good to get accuracy on, decent accuracy on many ML applications.
That's right. So it's all fixed point arithmetic, and you can go up to 16 bits, right? Maximum.
It can go up to 16 bits. Right?
Oh, thank you.
The AI engines also, some flavor of them also have the ability to do floating point. But again, that comes with its own set of trade-offs.
Wow, even floating point, is it?
I believe some of them do. I'll
see.
verify that and get back to you.
I see. Sure.
Yeah, the spec was evolving. So, yeah, I'll just double check and get back.
Sure.
Let me know when you can. So can you see the screen now?
Yes.
So we basically looked at different types of heterogeneous computing nodes, right? So now the next question is, given if you had an application to build, and let's say you had a choice of, what kind of accelerator to use, right? How would you choose? Let's say you had your choice, right? So the first thing that determines your choice of accelerator is performance versus power requirements, right? And often there is a trade-off between the two, in the sense that if you need higher performance, typically you will have to burn more power to get it, right? And these requirements also change a lot if you look at applications on the edge versus the cloud. Okay, so cloud applications are basically applications that run in the data center, whereas edge applications are applications that run, more at the user end. So, an example is a surveillance camera, or a program running on your cell phone. So those are applications that run on the edge. Something that you do in an application that runs when you do Google search, for example, or do an image search, that would run on the cloud. And then there are programs which are mixed, right? For example, when you say, hey Siri to your cell phone, or okay Google, right? Some part of the processing happens on the edge. And a lot of the smarts in how the program responds to you are actually processed on the cloud and they come to you. Okay, so we'll take a short break here to do an quick activity. So maybe we'll take 10 minutes and ask students to basically post on the chat window, post your, any example you can think of a cloud application. So we'll do, take 5 minutes and list some cloud applications, and then we'll take 5 minutes and list some edge applications. Okay, so we'll go with cloud first. Let's see how many examples this group can come out with. So post it on the chat window. So we have a few coming in. Media storage, a virtual machine running on a cloud. That's a good example. Friends recommendation on Facebook. Okay. ML training. A couple of people have said that. Tracking a device. Yes, that's a good application. AWS, Azure, etc. I would not call them applications. That's really the cloud infrastructure itself that you're referring to. So that is Bharat. Then online office, yes, that runs on the cloud. Yes, storage on the cloud, similar to what somebody else mentioned. Yeah, Google Colab or GitHub. So Internet of Things. I don't know. Megha, would you want to comment? Why do you think it runs on the cloud? Or what aspect of it are you saying runs on the cloud? collating data from a number of sensors. Yes, that is something that could run on the cloud if you think about an IoT application.
Actually,
Some of these, yeah, please go ahead, Megha.
yes, in case of Internet of Things, like whatever data we are getting from the sensors, they get stored in the cloud. And like from that data set only the further processing takes place as to what action to take. If like some like if we have like set some limits and the data is like surpassing that limit, so
Right.
like the data gets stored in the cloud only.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So, okay, so we've seen a lot of applications. I think many of the others are very similar. So database management, which really ties into banking or financial applications, a big data analysis, yes, web hosting, Drive, Zoom is a good example, yes. Dropbox is, yeah, similar to Drive, that's storage. Yeah, an application like, Moodle, where you can coordinate your coursework, that is something that runs on the cloud. MATLAB Online, yes, database management. Okay. Voice assistants, okay, so great. So we have a lot of examples. Yes, was there a question?
Yes, ma'am. Can Internet of Things be categorized both as edge and cloud, since when we take data from the sensor, that could be towards the user end, and then when we store the data on the cloud, that goes on the cloud end. So there is a combination of edge and cloud both.
Correct. And that is something which, yeah, you will actually see in a lot of these applications. There is, nowadays what is happening is, so earlier, right, it was very hard to get cheap compute close to the sensor. And that's why it made sense to send everything to the cloud. But now that, compute is becoming more commoditized, right, it is becoming easier to bring compute closer to the sensor. Right? And can anyone, talk about why you would actually want to do that? Maybe Diksha, since you brought this up, why do you think you would want to, bring compute close to the sensor?
Ma'am, one layman thing that I could think of is many a times where we are doing computing, internet is not good or something like that. So computing, if it's happening on the user end, it's more promising.
Okay, that's a good reason. More reliable processing of data, less data exposed to the cloud. That's something which somebody has put on chat. So that is privacy. And then, yes, the second, this point which someone has sent, you take, pre-process your data so that you reduce the cost of sending data to the cloud. And you can take decisions faster. Yes, there was somebody else who had a comment. Kalesha, am I pronouncing your name right?
Yes, ma'am. Security reasons. That's what I'm saying. Chat.
Right. Security. Yes, security or privacy also could be a reason. You may not want to send raw data to the cloud. Okay. So let us. Okay. So now we're getting more examples. Cloud gaming. Yes. So yeah, so anyway, so back to this. So for these reasons, right, it actually now you'll find that, there is an intermediate layer now between the edge and the cloud. So you'll find that, sensors connect either to, some compute which is very close to the sensor, or to an intermediate cloud, which is, owned by the person who owns the sensor. So you do some local computation and then decide what you send to the cloud. So even in wireless networks, this whole concept of O-RAN is, based on that. Basically, you have a local cloud where you do some processing of cell phone signals and data, and you don't go all the way to a primary cloud host in order to do it. So now let's switch to edge. So can we get some examples of edge applications? Okay. Tesla, I would say, is a bit mixed. Computer vision algorithms, okay. Where would you use them? Smart watches is a very good example. So where would you use computer vision algorithms on the edge? Could you name an application? Autonomous robots is a very good example. Okay, so now some things are going all over the place. So I don't think Bluetooth necessarily is the kind of, so yes, it is something that runs on sensors, but the applications that we are talking about for the purpose of this course, right, there are more applications that require a lot of computation. Surveillance systems, yes, that is a very good application of computer vision in hospital patient monitoring, yes. ML models to detect law violations in time. Now, some of these, why would you say that is an edge application? For example, in hospital patient monitoring, would you call it an edge application? Surveillance to me makes sense because you would detect an intruder, you do some compute then and there, maybe fire an alarm. So Chetan Mittal gave that example in hospital patient monitoring. Do you want to explain why you think it's an edge application?
Ma'am, because according to me, like edge computing is something that distributed computing framework that brings enterprises applications closer to data sources. So I thought like it will be used in edge computing.
Okay. Okay. So that's somewhat close to surveillance. Disaster management drones, yes. Sign language, yeah. Speech converter, speech recognition, yes. These are all good applications that run on the edge. Okay. So now that we have got everyone thinking a little bit about cloud versus edge, let's get back to the class. Share screen again. So now question for you all. How do performance and power requirements vary on the edge versus the cloud? Anyone wants to answer? So let's start with performance. How is performance different on the edge versus the cloud? How is the requirement for an application which has to run on the edge versus the cloud? What would the difference be? Okay, so one difference is that on the cloud you tend to look at operations having much higher throughput. So you want to be able to run a large number of operations per second. Okay. On the edge, actually, what you look for is latency. So any application which runs on the edge typically needs to respond in real time. Okay. If you were to take an example of surveillance, it's not of much use to have a surveillance camera which takes 10 minutes to tell you that you have an intruder. Right? You want it to be able to recognize that there is an intruder and alert you very quickly. Right? Whereas, if I look at a similar, image classification algorithm that runs on the cloud, which is Google Image Search, the requirement there on the Google server is that it processes a very large number of images per second, right? So that it can service a large number of requests. Is that distinction clear? Right. So with regard to performance, the requirements on the edge versus the cloud are different. With regard to power, so power is definitely a consideration at both ends. Now, edge appliances typically run on batteries, so the power requirement is needs to be low there. It has to you have to have a battery that runs for a long time. Right? On the cloud, again, there is a requirement. So computing which runs on the cloud can tolerate much higher power per node compared to something that runs on the edge. Right? But the difference there is that data centers actually invest a lot in cooling. And there's a whole very interesting technology around how racks are stacked up, how they are cooled, and so on. So there's a lot of sophisticated technology which is required to keep data centers cool. And therefore, while there are not, so the power requirements per node are often gated by that. So whereas per node, it is definitely higher than what is required for, let's say, a computer that runs with a small camera or a sensor, which you can, put on your doorstep. Right? But there is still a power requirement, and that comes from the cooling of the data center. Then the second constraint after performance and power is cost. So how much would you be willing to spend to build your application? And this in turn, depends on the market for that application, who you think will buy it, how you'll amortize the development cost over the number of units that you expect to sell. And this varies a lot. So heavy duty servers and GPUs are very, very expensive. If you had to build a custom ASIC, the cost of developing that is very different from using reconfigurable computing. FPGA, high-end FPGAs are expensive, but they can be reconfigured. So yes, so this also varies a lot based on the application. Now, the next thing you look at is you actually have to profile the program and the workload to understand what choice of accelerator is the right one for you. For example, if you have parallelism in compute, right? By that I mean, do you have operations that you need to that you can run in parallel because they don't have dependencies on each other, right? And are these coarse-grained versus fine-grained? For example, do I, is it something that I can multi-thread, as in keep, my different parallel computations running on different threads because they don't need to exchange much data between them? Or, is it very, do I need fine-grained threads, or if it's very, very coarse-grained, can I actually run it with multiple processes? So the OS is an example where we actually run, a lot of processes, right? And that kind of parallelism is more coarse-grained. Whereas, if you were running a parallel computing operation, let's say to do some arithmetic or, some manipulation, maybe you were building a router to route the layout of a chip, right? You might actually choose to have fine-grained parallelism where you divide your chip into 32 bins and you have a thread that works on each bin in parallel. So that kind of parallelism is what we would call compute parallelism. And that, the kind of parallelism that you have would dictate, how many cores you might need, what kind of cores you might need, and so on. Right? Now, on the other hand, in this, right, you might have compute parallelism of a different kind, right? You might have, for example, a convolution operation that you need to, perform efficiently, right? And by breaking up the convolution and recognizing that it's the same operation, but it acts on different parts of a matrix, you could actually parallelize, doing the multiplication of a smaller matrix. And maybe you could implement this on an FPGA or some kind of custom hardware. Do you have a lot of data parallelism? That is, do you need to run the same operation on large amounts of data? And GPUs are especially good at this. And that's one reason why they have actually scaled well to do training for AI as well. So they have a lot of data parallelism. Now, if something is very control heavy, then you may be better off using a CPU to take care of that kind of application, right? And a complex application may have aspects of all these, right? And that is where the notion of an accelerator comes in. So if I have a big application, I may choose to actually run the control part of it on a CPU, right? I may choose to have a GPU to run, parts of it which are, just crunch through data very quickly, right? I may, recognize that there are certain operations which can run very fast in hardware, like, convolution or matrix multiplication. And I may choose to, accelerate just those operations on an FPGA. Right? So the key to understanding how to build your accelerated system is actually to profile what you have to do and understand the inherent structure of both your application and the kind of workload that you have to handle. Then some other important factors that one would have to consider is how would you So the other thing that you would like to consider is scalability. Right? So is it easy to parallelize something as I can add more cores or threads or compute units to it, right? And does something scale well as you keep parallelizing, right? That also tells you how much effort it is worth putting in to actually parallelize or accelerate something. And then another dimension is basically the development time. Is it going to be easy to program your application? Can you easily verify that it runs correctly? Right? So this is a very important factor because it adds to the cost. So the choice you might make if you were building something for a hackathon or as a hobby may be very different. If this was something you had to basically run in a time critical application. Let's say you wanted to accelerate something to do weather forecasting, for example. So yeah, then the final constraint which one looks at is portability. And this may or may not apply. So typically this applies when people want to release something in the public domain for wide usage. So there you might want to think, right? Can my application be written in such a way that it can port easily to any kind of heterogeneous system? So can I write it in such a way that if somebody has a multi-core processor, they can run it. If they are able to plug in an FPGA accelerator, they can run it. Or if they have a GPU, they can run it. Right? And this, we see as a consideration in things like some of these open libraries. So if you look at OpenCV, for example, they have a CPU version of it. NVIDIA releases a CUDA version of OpenCV where those vision functions are actually tuned to run well on GPUs. Right? If you were building a vision system around ARM, you might want to release a version which is well tuned to ARM as well. And then finally, reliability. This is more for systems that need to go into space. You worry a lot about how reliable they will be in that kind of environment. Power plays a little bit of a role here as well. So any questions here?
When do we use data parallelism and compute parallelism?
So if, as in, you mean what accelerator would you use, or?
No, like when will we use, for which program, which type of program will we use data parallelism and compute parallelism?
Okay, so a very good example of data parallelism is systolic array. Have you heard about systolic arrays?
No.
Okay, so these are arrays where basically you end up doing the same operation on data. So as data keeps coming in, you keep doing the same operation on that data. So the data changes, but your operation doesn't. So that that is one example. Maybe we'll go a little deeper into it, give some examples with pictures when we talk about SIMD. We can go a little more into detail there. Right. So can you hold your question maybe?
Okay.
Yeah. And compute parallelism is where you can basically identify, chunks of instructions which have no dependencies between each other.
Okay, thank you.
All right. That's your traditional way of thinking about multi-threaded programming. Right? Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think for data parallelism, it's easier if you understand, this whole notion of SIMD and you look at some pictures. So maybe we'll look at that in more depth in the next class or in another future class. So for the purpose of this course, right, this is the accelerator model that we are going to look at. Right? So broadly, when you think about accelerators, right, it could be anything. It could be one host with, a whole set of parallel accelerators. It could be one host with, multiple with many different types of accelerators built into a system. It could be multiple hosts, servicing a farm of FPGA cards, for example, right? And but for the purpose of this course, what we'll consider as our accelerator is the following model. So basically, we'll have a host computer or a server. So this could be a laptop or a desktop which connects to your FPGA board. Or this could be a server running on AWS. So AWS is what we are going to use unless someone has an embedded board that they want to try. So there it is basically, it's a server. It's a CPU server, right? And our accelerator card will be an FPGA, which will plug into the host computer or server. So what we'll start with basically is we take the host computer, profile the application, and then figure out what part of it you want to run on the accelerator. Okay? So basically you start out with code which entirely runs on the host. This is your application. And once you have profiled and decided what to accelerate, your code basically will be divided into two parts. One is code which runs on the host, and the second is code which runs on your accelerator, which we call the kernel code. So a kernel is a term that we will use to refer to the part of the computation that is being accelerated. Okay. So
one question.
Sure.
Ma'am, is this similar to like cloud computing and data computing, the previous accelerator card? So we are taking an application divided into two. The one half of the application is performed by the host and second by the accelerator. So is it similar to data computing or parallel computing?
So it's not, I wouldn't say it's, it's half necessarily, right? I didn't catch the last term that you said. Is it similar to?
Is it similar to like parallel computing or like data computing, just the data parallelism or computing parallelism?
No. So this is a little different, right? Because your nodes are heterogeneous. So see, if I have, let's say I have a gigantic server, right? You must be having servers in your computer center, right? And now when you give a job, when you fire off a job on the server, what happens? The server, the infrastructure that you have running reserves some codes for your jobs to run, right? Right? And depending on whether you have 2 threads or 4 threads or 16 threads, it will reserve some number of cores. Your application will run, one thread will run on a core, right? And then your application will collect all the data and then get it back, right? So that is more of a homogeneous model of compute. If you look at a typical LSF farm, for example, that's what it is, right? And AWS and Azure and all, that is really what they are. If you look at their CPU farms, that's really what they are doing, right? They are reserving cores, compute cores for you out of a homogeneous set of cores. Right? So there you are sort of parallelizing your application into different threads, and you're saying, okay, I need so many threads to run my application, right? And these threads all execute in parallel. And then my program, merges the data or the results from each thread, brings it back, and sends it. Right? Now here, for when I run it with an accelerator, one important difference is this has now become a heterogeneous system, right? So I have a server on which my main application runs, right? And I have made a decision to take a part of the application and offload it. Right? And why have I decided to offload that part of the application? Anyone? Let me give you a more concrete example. Right? Let us say I'm running an object classification on my server farm. Okay, and I decide that in the course of doing this object classification, okay, there is a matrix multiplication which I need to do, right, in my deep learning model. Okay, so you all understand some basics of how deep learning models work, and there is convolution operation which happens there very often, right? And the basis of convolution really is matrix multiplication. Okay, so I may decide that matrix multiplication is an operation that I'm doing very frequently, right? And so when I profile my application, I say, all right, so matrix multiplication is my bottleneck here. So if I can do matrix multiplication faster, then I can handle more image object classifications per second. Okay, which means, if this is a, camera mounted on a traffic light, then, I can recognize more number plates per second maybe, or, recognize more traffic violations per second, right? Okay, so there I have decided that what is running on my host is an object classification or image classification application, right? And I have identified that matrix multiplication is the bottleneck. And if I run it faster, my overall application will have higher throughput. Okay, so I say, let me accelerate matrix multiplication. I won't run it on this host or this general purpose computer. I will run it on a card which is tuned to do matrix multiplication really fast. Okay, and maybe this card is, it's an FPGA card. Maybe it's even, if you're very rich, you could build a small ASIC that does matrix multiplication very efficiently. Right? Let's say for the purposes of this course that it's an FPGA card. So what does my host do? Every time there is a matrix multiply, that matrix multiplication goes to the accelerator. So the host sends data over, the accelerator does the matrix multiplication and sends the result back. Now my accelerator could do, maybe it does one matrix multiplication in a compute unit. Maybe it has 4 compute units and it can do 4 matrix multiplications in parallel, right? Or maybe I have one computer and I have 10 accelerator cards because I have profiled my application and I have realized if I can do 10 matrix multiplications in parallel, my performance speeds up. Right? So the control is here. So the host decides what to offload and when to offload. Right? And the accelerator does the offloaded computation and sends the result back. Did that make sense? Did that answer your question?
Ma'am, just another question rose into my mind.
Sure.
Like when the accelerator is performing the calculation and it sends the data back, what if the speeds don't match? For example, when the computer requires the data before only the accelerator sends the data back.
Yeah, so that brings us into some considerations of how you would design it, right? So when you design these systems, you have to design it in such a way that, you accelerate. So basically, the ideal way to design a system is such that your accelerator is never idle. Okay? So if your accelerator computes things very fast and it sends, data back, it's okay. It can, wait in the host memory for the host to use it, right? So that could be one way to solve that problem, right? Or you could choose to do it, just in time, right? You have a little buffer and you ensure that that buffer never overflows by too much. So you don't waste too many resources either in buying a heavy duty accelerator for something that doesn't need that kind of performance, right? So that also becomes an important factor in choosing how you design your accelerator.
Okay.
So you have to decide what to offload. You have to decide at what speed this needs to run, right? So that it can service your application. Now, if you run it at a much faster speed than your host application needs, what are you doing actually? What are you losing out on?
Cost, and performance.
Not cost, you're losing out on power, right? If my
Okay.
accelerator, let's say I need to run matrix multiplications at some speed. Okay, I want to do 500 matrix multiplications per second. That's what my host application needs, right? I have this image classification application. For that, I need to run 500 matrix multiplications a second. Okay. Now, if I build an accelerator that can do, let us say, 300 matrix multiplications a second, is that good enough for me? No, because I will have to run my host application slower, right? If I can only do 300 matrix multiplications a second, my host application will have to run at a slower speed, correct?
Right, ma'am.
Right? Now, what if instead of 500, my accelerator runs 800 matrix multiplications per second? Then what happens? Sure, I can continue to run this at whatever speed I need. I can run the host application at whatever speed I need. But then what am I doing in the accelerator? I'm burning more power.
Yes, ma'am.
Correct? So that is where the trade-off comes. So, you have to design. So when you design your system, it has to be designed in such a way that, what you're offloading runs at the speed that you require. Right? Now, this is not to say that everything has to be just in time, right? You will need buffering to ensure that things work reliably. But, if you make your accelerator run too fast, you burn too much power. If it runs too slow, then you won't get the performance that you require.
Okay.
Makes sense? This is an important concept actually, and you will need to think about your projects in this way when you do them. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Ma'am, at the end, this type of setup is for the edge computing, as we will discuss in 7th slide.
Well, yes and no. Yes and no. So it looks very much like an edge computing application. So for example, if you had a laptop, right, and you have a PCI Express slot, right, you can plug a little card into that. You can plug an FPGA card into that PCI Express slot. And in fact, you will find there are embedded, embedded cards that allow you to do it. You can plug a little, microcontroller card even if you want, or if you use Raspberry Pi or Android, right? They also work the same way. They're little compute units that you can plug in and use, right? Now, in such a scenario, yes, this is an edge application. Now, what happens in the cloud? So, for example, when you use AWS, right? What is actually happening in AWS when you use FPGAs? So AWS actually has cards in which they have, 8 FPGA devices on a card. And they provide this through a service which they call FAS, F-A-A-S, FPGA as a service. Okay. And so AWS actually has servers. They have CPU servers and they have these cards with FPGAs. And they have a framework that allows you to, reserve, just like, you would reserve CPUs if you used regular AWS, right, through software as a service. Now here you would actually reserve, some number of FPGAs to do the acceleration. So this means here you can basically do not just edge applications, but you can do fairly sophisticated applications. If you wanted to do genomics, right, there are some types of string matching algorithms which are very critical in genomics. And they are, accelerated. So, you could run genomics applications on your servers with some of the string matching accelerator. Right? You could do database querying on your servers, And there are aspects of the database query which are accelerated. There are some parts of Hadoop which lend themselves very well to acceleration. Right? So this model is not restricted to just an edge kind of application. This is more just conceptually for you to understand. Right? So when we say you're using an accelerator here, it could be just one. It could be many. It depends on the what you want to accelerate, right? And based on the application, what is the workload that you need to accelerate? What are the kind of chips you have available as accelerators? How many of them do you need? Get it?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So that is why a very key part of this whole thing is this profiling. And you will see as you build your projects that you need to come back to this again and again to understand how to profile the application. And what to accelerate. Are you accelerating the right thing? Once you've accelerated something, the bottleneck shifting, can you make your architecture a little more optimal to get rid of those bottlenecks? That's what makes this whole thing very interesting also. Any other questions? Okay. So one last point here. So when semiconductor manufacturers design accelerators, more easily you are able to plug an accelerator into an existing software framework, the easier it is going to be to design and use accelerators on demand. And this is a very important point. This is a big reason behind the popularity of NVIDIA's GPUs. So they actually invested a lot over 10-15 years in building up, CUDA as a programming language, the whole framework, libraries, everything using CUDA, which has made it very, very easy to, take a GPU and learn how to program it. Right? So the notion of having a software or some kind of framework which allows you to easily program the accelerator and plug it into your existing system is what actually makes these easy to use and easy to adopt. And that is where the races will find different people, companies that build accelerators, right? That is where the thrust is actually in also making sure that they plug into existing frameworks. And that's especially true when you think about machine learning, because many of the software frameworks are now open source and in the public domain, whether it's PyTorch or TensorFlow or Caffe. And so people who have code which is already written in that framework would need to figure out how to accelerate it easily. So the more seamless it is to, take a piece of code and say, this is my function that I want to accelerate. This is the accelerator I choose. Now go and do it. Right? The easier it will be. And you will face some of these challenges firsthand as you accelerate on FPGAs. Because this is a system in which the ease of use has been continuously evolving. It has come a long way in the last 4 or 5 years. But it is still evolving. So you will definitely see some of these gaps there when you do your projects. Any other questions? So let's just quickly brush through how we would measure performance on these systems. So a generic definition of throughput is the total amount of work that is completed per unit time. So an example of how you measure throughput would be, frames per second when you look at an image processing pipeline, or video analytics, or images per second if you look at image classification or image recognition, right? Or if you think about a database, right? A number of queries per second. So all these are measures of throughput, and depending on your application, the units that you would use for that are different. But broadly, throughput refers to the amount of work completed per unit time. Now, bandwidth is similar actually. bandwidth also relates to the amount of work done in unit time. The difference between bandwidth and throughput is that bandwidth is more of a theoretical bound. So bandwidth tells you what is the maximum throughput that your system can sustain. Okay. So that is that's an important consideration to keep in mind. When you actually build your applications, you will talk more in terms of throughput and latency. But it's a good idea to think about and see if you can analyze the bandwidth also, which is what is the throughput that your system is capable of. Then you also measure latency. Now, latency is the time elapsed between the initiation and completion of a task. And in general, you will see that there is a trade-off between latency and throughput, especially when you pipeline applications. So this trade-off basically comes, because as you pipeline, it takes you more time to start a task and finish it because it is in the pipeline. But because of the pipeline, you're able to get more things done per second. The unit of latency typically is time. And we talked about this, some applications which are high throughput and low latency when we talked about edge versus cloud. So typically you will find that applications which are on the cloud tend to have a requirement for high throughput because basically the cloud is servicing a large number of requests, right? And you want to be able to service more requests per second. Whereas things which are on the edge tend to have a lower latency requirement because you want them to be responsive. Right? Now, there are some exceptions to this. Video conferencing, for example, is something which actually runs on the cloud, but it has a low latency requirement. Right? You actually want your, video conferencing software to be highly responsive, right? If there is a change, you want to be able to see it. Right? Speech recognition is another one, which is, a low latency application, though it does run on the cloud. Right? So no rules here, just some, broad observations. Any questions? So one thing that I hope you're all able to do at this point is to correlate, this whole notion of heterogeneous computing with some of the applications that you're seeing today in real life. Right? So it's important not to think of this in isolation when you do any course, right? But try to understand how you can correlate this with things that you use in your daily life. So now let us shift to the heterogeneous computing model itself. So some important things to understand here are, one is, where does the data reside? And how does the host transfer data to the accelerator? Okay. So for this, now so far we looked at the host computer or server and an accelerator, right? This is a familiar picture. Now remember, the host has some memory. In fact, it would have a memory hierarchy on it for any typical CPU or GPU, right? And the accelerator also has some memory, right? And this is required to figure out, where to put the data. So now what we have to look at when modeling any kind of heterogeneous computing is to understand how does the host, where does the data sit at, different points of time during the computation, and how is data transferred to and from the accelerator. So this should be to and from actually. So let's just take a step back and look at PCIe. So PCIe is basically a high-speed serial interface. So it was derived from PCI, peripheral component interface, which was a shared bus architecture used in the earliest computers on motherboards. So it was used to help peripherals communicate with the CPU. So this is a derivative of that. It's called PCI Express. And the reason it's called Express is because it's a high-speed interface. So, and it uses a point-to-point topology. It's no longer a shared bus architecture. And basically you have a separate serial link between each device and the host. Okay. And all communication on PCIe is packetized. So you have lanes where each lane consists of 4 wires, 1 pair for transmit, 1 pair for receive. And you can configure your PCI bus to use anything from 1 lane to 32 lanes in powers of 2. So you have 1, 2, 4, 16, 32, and so on. And there is basically a PCI port. You'll see this on all your devices. You'll see it on your laptop. It's there on servers. If you remember the FPGA lecture from last time, we talked about PCI hard block to take care of transactions. And packetizing, depacketizing, status handling is all taken care of at the PCI port. Okay. Now, an interesting development in recent years is basically interconnect protocols which are being built on top of PCI. And these are being built specifically for accelerators. So there are two different protocols which are being talked about in industry today. These are basically driven through industry consortia. So group of companies get together to define these interfaces. And the reason they need to define it together is that they must all implement it so that their systems can work together. So there is C6 and CXL. So the interesting thing about these protocols is that they're basically cache coherent interconnect. So it allows you to access, it's an interconnect which allows you to access memory in a cache coherent way. The cache coherence is built in. And CXL is a more CPU-centric protocol. This is being driven by Intel. So here for every transaction, pretty much you have to go back to the CPU. So it's more of a master-slave type of configuration or leader-follower type of configuration. Whereas C6 is more open. It allows any piece of hardware which is connected to the interface to take control. It leaves the control more to the user. So these are also some interesting new developments. I'll share some articles. If you're interested, you can take a look at them. So PCI is important because we basically use PCI typically to communicate between the host and the accelerator. Okay. So if you deep dive into the view of the host and the accelerator, it kind of looks like this. So the host, for example, it could be an x86 CPU, and the host has its own memory, right? So it has levels of cache, and all that forms its own memory. Now the accelerator in turn, right, has, so it has some hardware available on which you can accelerate. Now it has its own local memory. So if this accelerator was an FPGA, can you correlate this local memory to any units that we talked about last time? Anybody?
DRAMs and DRAM.
Correct, not DRAM. DRAM lies outside the chip. So DRAM is this global memory. But yes, block RAMs and ultra RAMs on the FPGA, they are local memory on the accelerator, right? If this was a GPU accelerator, the GPU has its own, memory hierarchy, right? And every accelerator has to implement some kind of communication infrastructure by which it can communicate with the host. Okay, so a common way of communicating through the host is through PCIe, right? You will also find there are, some accelerators where they may implement a DMA, which is a direct memory access, right? So the host may actually directly access the global memory here on the accelerator, and the accelerator also will have a way to access it. Okay, so this is the broad kind of model of how memory and communication happens between the host and the accelerator. Now, this is assuming one accelerator. The picture gets more complex if you have many. Right? For the purposes of this course, we'll assume one. So exactly what happens now when you accelerate? Right? So basically the host would reserve some space in its host memory. Right? So the green boxes that I'm showing here would contain the inputs to whatever computation you want to accelerate. Okay. Let's say I'm offloading matrix multiplication. Okay, so these two may be the two matrices that I want to multiply. So they are stored in buffers here, right? And then the host will also reserve space to store the output. So this gray area, let's say in this, for this example, refers to the output matrix that I want to read back. Okay. Now, what happens is the accelerator, right, will also have to reserve some space in its global memory to keep the inputs, right, and to store the output. And then what happens is the host will then communicate. So the first thing that happens is data has to transfer. So my inputs will be transferred from the host memory to the global memory. Okay. At that point, the accelerator is ready to run. So the accelerator takes the inputs from the global memory, right? It may actually have implement its own caching mechanism by which it prefetches and stores some of it in local memory. Right? It performs the computation, puts the output in the output buffer here, right? And then signals the host to say, I'm ready, I'm done. At that point, the host transfers data back. Right? And you could look at many ways to optimize this. For example, instead of waiting for the entire computation to be done, you might want to compute in chunks and send data back in chunks so that the host can do something with them. All that depends on your application. But the broad model to keep in mind is this. Okay, you have a host and accelerator. They are communicating through PCIe, maybe DMA. Right? You transfer data to global memory that the accelerator can access. Right? The accelerator reads in the data, computes, writes the output, which is then transferred back to the host. Okay, any questions here?
Ma'am, in this setup, can't there if as sometimes more time is taken for transferring the data, and then again the work is done, and then the output is going again to the host. Can't the host and accelerator have the same shared memory, that the blue box which you're saying?
Yes, yes. So that is also something that one could look at, which is why you'll find that there are some accelerators which actually implement DMA. So the host also will have access to this. Now, shared memory is typically efficient only when the memory resides on the same chip. See, here we are thinking about a case where the CPU and accelerator are on two different chips. Right? Now, you'll find chips in the market today which have a CPU and GPU on the same chip, and they actually share a memory. So in that case, yes, it makes sense. But that kind of scenario, shared memory, makes sense only when both are on the same chip. Right? On the other extreme, right, you also find situations in embedded processing where you have an ARM core and some other little IP that does some processing. Right? It may be an ASIC or it may be a microcontroller. It could even be an FPGA like Zinc. Right? And there again, you'll find that they have access to the same memory because it is on the same, board. Okay.
Ma'am, this is Aditya. It's the current setup which you are showing. Is it like that host is on a different CAC and this accelerator card is on a different CAC?
Yes.
And you have
yes.
a PCIe link through cables
yes.
connecting these two CACs.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. So this is a situation where this is on a card. So this is on one board and this is on another board, right? And so as I was saying earlier, where it makes sense to have a shared memory is where both are on the same board. Makes sense?
So in that case, like the accelerator card, it will be directly plugged in on the CAC or on the PCI slot, whichever it provides, instead of extending it into a different rack.
Yes, that's definitely one option. That's definitely one option. So that is more on the on the embedded side, when you have an embedded card that you can plug in, Right? In something like AWS, it basically works a little bit differently. Right? So they have their own infrastructure with which to handle the communication.
Okay.
Yeah. The thing to take away from this is the basic principle, right? How it is actually implemented will vary depending on the scenario. So now typically, right, you try to keep the address space between the host and the accelerator disjoint. And the reason for doing that is it makes the memory management much easier, right? And as we discussed, accelerators can also contain a memory hierarchy. So for example, you can use block RAM and DRAM on FPGAs. Right? Now you could also have a case where there are multiple accelerators. For example, I could have a board with 8 FPGA chips and some global memory on that board. Right? And what do we do then? Right? So one option, of course, is to partition the memory into disjoint address spaces. Right? Another option is to keep shared global memory. Of course, if your global memory is shared, how do you ensure coherence? Right? One option is, you might have a hardware controller that ensures coherence. Another option could be, to put the onus on the user, right? And say you have to schedule your software operations and your read and writes in such a way that your data is coherent. As someone who's providing the accelerator framework, it's not my responsibility. Okay. And here an interesting thing to look at is the notion of zero copy. So zero copy, some of you may have studied about it in operating systems courses. And that's typically used when you have a unified address space, right? And that concept has been imported into these hardware systems that have accelerators and shared memory by using it to optimize data movement. So basically, if you have multiple accelerators or a host and an accelerator looking at data in a common memory, then you basically take care of try to access data by doing pointer passing as much as possible without actually moving data onto your accelerator from the memory. Okay, concept is very similar to the OS concept. It's just it has been imported into this paradigm. So I guess we are out of time here. So maybe we'll cover this next time, or should I quickly zip through it? Suresh, what do you suggest?
Maybe next time, Padmini, they have another class at 2 o'clock.
Okay. Okay.
Maybe it needs somebody.
Okay.
So we can continue the first half, whatever we can plan to continue this in the next class.
Okay. Yeah, I think I may this won't take more than maybe 20 minutes or so.
Yeah. Sure.
How was the pace today? Can we have a show of hands? Was the pace